Time doesn't erase murder. It just hides it better. They said the case was closed. They said no one was watching. But someone always is. This is Santana True Crime.
Welcome to Santana True Crime. Tonight we've got something special. We've never done this before. We've decided to do a 4-part Halloween special, and we are going to kick it off with the Candyman Murders. The Candyman Murders was the Ronald Clark O'Bryan case. We'll get into that in a little bit, but before we do, I want to introduce our guest host. We've got Kelli Brink, who is an author and podcaster. She is the author of the True Crime Sleep series, and you can also check her out on YouTube at kellibrink.com, and as well as Jayson Blair. And
Hey,
Jayson Blair is a journalist. He's been on the show before. Hopefully, you've checked out that episode with Ashley Loring Heavy Runner. Great episode. And not the last person, but my brother, Brian Santana. He is the author of everybody's favorite book, A Murder on Campus, The Professor, the Cop, and North Carolina's most notorious cold case. I did that with him. Welcome to the show.
thanks for having
Yeah,
me.
thank you.
Appreciate
Glad to
it.
be back.
It's always nice to be on to talk about my favorite month and my favorite topic, scary things.
Yeah,
Same,
absolutely.
yeah.
And I feel like that, this being true crime and being Halloween, yeah, I know that there's a lot of things that we can laugh about, but there's also those serious cases, and they definitely blend together. And especially of how traditions are formed. And I always wonder of where these things started from. Like, where's the lore in, for example, tonight, checking candy? So, Professor Brian Santana, you want to give us a rundown of this case?
Sure. So while this case really is one that kind of is going to throw fuel on the fire of these urban legends about kind of the stranger dangers of candy, this is a case that really, that urban legend really predates this case, but this case is really what is kind of going to shape a lot of our own kind of childhood experiences, I think, with Halloween. So this case took place on Halloween night of 1974, and it involved a 30-year-old optician named Ronald Clark O'Bryan. Ronald Clark O'Bryan was a guy who lived in suburban Houston with his 8-year-old son Timothy and his 5-year-old daughter Elizabeth. And basically, this is a story about the death of his son Timothy on that night from a poisoned pixie stick, and all of the kind of mayhem and kind of panic that it sets off, both in the local suburban kind of Houston area, but then also the rest of the country as well.
So, Kelly, had you heard of this case before? And I'm sure that, probably growing up and even today, the whole like check your candy idea, you know, how did
Yeah.
that affect you?
Well, okay, so actually, I was not totally familiar with the details of this case. I've heard variations of this case, poisoned candy and things like that. I didn't know the actual details of it. And we all know the stories about like the razor blades in the candy and the needles in the candy and stuff like that. I grew up in that era in the late 70s, early 80s. So I've never really known a life where you didn't have to check your candy. It's always been kind of dangerous, and I've always checked my kids' candy, or I'm like wary about where we get candy, and it's just I really don't like it. And now I don't even give candy out. I'm trying to be healthier and stuff, but also I'm like, I'm just going to give toothbrushes this year. But yeah, as a mom, I'm definitely very cautious about trick-or-treating candy. It changed a lot of things though. Like I think trunk or treat and things like that
Yeah.
spurred from these kinds of stories. It changed the landscape. It really transformed trick-or-treating and holidays, and like you can't just go to a random door and get treats from people because you might get a trick. Yeah.
Well, this becomes not only like the trunk or treat as well. This also becomes this whole thing of like, if you want a safe way to trick or treat, then go to your local big box stores, and they're going to be giving out candy. And this is the kind of safe way to kind of experience the holiday. So there's a lot of different, really interesting interests that kind of pop up in this story, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, Brian, do you want to walk us through this case? Let's give me some background on Ronald Clark O'Bryan, or you know what, Jayson, you know this case pretty well. If you want to,
well, I mean, either of us. Brian probably knows the case better than I, but I grew up with a lot. I'm a child of the '80s / early '90s, so I grew up with a lot of these urban legends, from what was it, Yellow Dye Number 5 to the spider that's going to bite you, and then spiders are going to burst out of your arm. And, this was always one of them. So a lot like you, Kelli, my entire childhood, like we would get home with our candy, our big buckets of candy. And there were always two things in every neighborhood I grew up in. There was the house you never went to.
Yes.
On Halloween, right? Like everybody's got that house, right? The house that you never would dare to go to. And then everybody checking their candy. Our parents with us checking our candy. And it's really funny. I grew up to be a parent, and I don't think I ever checked the candy. I was like, you guys are more responsible than me. You got this. Right? You're not fools. But yeah, the whole fear was that you were going to have a razor blade in your candy, or somehow it was going to be poisoned. So check to see if it's open. And the way I actually came across this case is I became really, really fascinated early in my reporting career with where the heck urban legends came from.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Yeah, and it was fascinating to me because if you roll back to sort of like the good old days and ancient times when I was there, and when I was growing up, you didn't have the internet. You had some national magazines, you had local newspapers, you had snail mail. It always fascinated me that, like, how do we have these same urban legends in the same towns? Like, did any of you guys have a Bunnyman Bridge? You can find the Bunnyman Bridge story almost anywhere. It just always fascinated me. So I got really interested in where these stories actually came from. And, I agree with Brian's point that while this case isn't necessarily the first case where the whole idea came from, because back in the 60s and the 70s, early 60s, the New York Times was writing articles about the fear of people poisoning candy or other risks along those lines. And, there was this Long Island case, Helen, what was her name? Helen Feifel or something along those lines. I'm going to go with Feifel. She was giving out poison tablets, ant poison tablets, dog biscuits, and steel wool to children in Long Island that she had deemed were too old to be participating in Halloween. I think she got like 60 days in the psych ward or something along those lines. And in her, in her case, the poison tablets were like marked poison, keep away from children and animals. Okay. And so her argument was it was a bit of a joke and it put people in danger. But even before that, there was like a California dentist in either the 50s or the early 60s who gave out like candy-coated laxatives that got like 20, 30 kids sick. So these stories had been around and newspapers had been writing about them. But when, the sociologists went back and looked, this is all before this case that we're talking about tonight. When they went back and looked, they couldn't find an instance where a child was actually killed or seriously injured through Halloween candy that was given to them by a stranger. But they could find instances where it was a non-stranger where things happened. Okay. Yeah, and it was a really fascinating thing because I think about where do some of these urban myths come from? Well, they come out of our fears, right? primal fears, danger to children, the unpredictability of strangers at a time where we were sort of losing trust and losing community trust. And, the ideas, our worries about contamination of food and the randomness of violence at a time that crime was becoming a bigger thing. And they sort of merge into these urban legends and existed before the story. And one of the fascinating things about studying this story, I had initially thought when I heard about it, like, this is the man who stole Halloween. He destroyed this. But I found out this was all going on well before it, and he may have just stolen the idea. So
yeah, he was very much aware. I think when he was thinking about this entire kind of crime that takes place, he was very much aware of these shifts that were taking place and how people kind of related to the holiday and the worries and fears that they had surrounding it. I mean, the case Jayson mentioned in Long Island, there's this the Times in some of the coverage, I believe, of that case had quoted this psychiatrist that was in Long Island named Reginald Steen. And one of the things that he essentially says is that, I'm looking at a quote from this article he wrote here. He says, people who give harmful treats to children see criminals and students and campus riots getting away with things, and they feel like I can get away with it too. And there's this idea that in a lot of the media at this time, that this fear of the kind of the poison candy for some commentators was this kind of representation of this larger sick society, this whole kind of corruption that was and kind of shifts that were taking place in America, in the midst of Vietnam and major kind of cultural shifts as well, I think.
Yeah, and there is, though, like so many of these stories, these urban legends, there's a moral lesson in there, right? We tell kids, don't. I tell the story about my uncle. I went out to visit him in Denver. Don't remember what his house looks like. Don't remember anything. I remember one dresser because he turned the lights off, shut the room. My brother and I were supposed to go to sleep. Then he opened the door again really quickly and said, "There's a boogeyman on this shelf. And he gets up if little kids get up, and he's going to come take you away." That's all I remember, because I woke up that morning and I looked for the boogeyman on the shelf, but I don't think I moved in between those two moments. But I think about that one, right? If my uncle had come in and said, "Hey, Jayson, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the benefits of REM sleep and the near and long-term advantages of getting deep sleep," I'd be like, "What are you talking about?" But you know what? The boogeyman probably did make me sleep. We tell kids, don't go out in the woods. You might get bitten by a werewolf. These are ways, I think, that we communicate important things to people in a way, in sort of both in a way that they can digest it, but in a weird way, the horror story version is more frightening in some ways than the reality, because it's not the werewolves you need to worry about out in the woods. No. It might be an accident. It might be an animal. It might be a really, really, really bad person out there. So I think they're really fascinating to me because they mix with moral panic and moral lessons and this folklore. But I do think it serves a purpose, the folklore and the urban legend that
Me
sits
too.
around it.
And it's not even just the horror stories. It's everything from to even Disney movies. There's always that enticement with something sweet, a pure innocent child, like the poisoned apple or things like that in kids movies. It's like being enticed with something sweet, but actually it's something evil in disguise.
Goes back to Genesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Adam, Eve, the apple.
Yeah.
Right. And it's a part of it. And there's an important lesson in there, I think, for people. I always think of Hansel and Gretel and the gingerbread house.
Yes.
And the great lesson I got out of that was, not everything that looks really good is actually good. So just because it's pretty doesn't mean it's good. And I think those are great lessons to learn. But what I find funny about true crime is that a lot of true crime fans run away from horror. They run away from horror stories. If I made a movie about this story and it was a horror story, they'd probably all run away from it. But I'm fascinated by the fact that they're cool with Ted Bundy and they're cool with Brian Koberger, and they want to know more about all these people. But I don't know. Can't take a little monster story.
The scariest monsters in life are real, to be
Yes.
honest. So, yeah. I think with the horror thing, some people have a problem with the occult or something like that. But
I, I think some of it's that. I really do think like it to your point, it like pushes people's buttons on certain issues because a lot of the anti-Halloween stuff,
mhm.
melds with some of the religious worries. I also think there's a part of it where these stories are meant to often sort of like teach us deeper lessons that we're even more uncomfortable with because like with a serial killer I can convince myself that I've gotten my head around Ted Bundy and I don't have brown hair and I am not a woman and he only went after these people so I don't want to do that. Like Boogeyman's a little harder. The like my favorite one is in the Algonquin tribes, native tribes. There is this malevolent creature called the Wendigo,
Mhm.
and the Wendigo. You don't want to say its name casually, um,
Uh-oh.
but it's associated with like winter and famine and isolation, and it is a metaphor for things like greed and selfishness. But what the Wendigo ultimately does, it has insatiable hunger, and it's a cannibal. So it's coming for you, right? And the moral lesson there, if you think about it, for those Algonquin tribes who traveled from areas like New York to the Great Lakes to Canada, it was about staying close to community, not being greedy, sharing with each other, staying close spiritually to the tribe. And I do think that some of the deeper underlying moral lessons under some of these stories, like you think Nightmare on Elm Street or even Jason. Like you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know. Like in the '80s, we kind of lost it a little bit, and we were acting kind of crazy as teenagers. I can confirm for you. And I don't think it's like a coincidence that a lot of the 1980s, 1990s horror movies are all about kids acting like idiots and getting chopped up.
Well, even speaking of the horror films, the year before this incident happened in 1973, we have William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist, and there's all these films that are focusing on like both like broken families and kind of children that are in danger, like the Linda Blair and that. And one of the things I think, if we think about this, you're talking about like metaphor, but if we think about this holiday metaphorically, like at this moment with this case, I mean, this is also a moment in time when how Americans relate to Halloween has dramatically shifted. I mean, this was at the turn of the century, Halloween was a children's holiday for the most part. And this was one of the few nights in the year where children went off by themselves, unchaperoned. And, in the 1970s, people like Margaret Mead, the famous cultural anthropologist, is going to talk about like Halloween had this like important socializing function for children at the turn of the century, and that it was this night for them to test the boundaries of adulthood and be able to kind of, transgress rules that they normally wouldn't have been able to find where those boundaries were. And by the time we get to Ronald Clark O'Bryan in 1974, the holiday looks very different. This isn't kids going out. I mean, in the 1920s and 30s, trick or treat was not like an open sesame for Halloween candy. Like they would be given like pranks that they would go out and play on other people to get the actual candy, whether it was like, toilet paper in someone's yard or, the equivalent of that in today's. And it's interesting that by the time we get to the 70s, it's become this like holiday that's really about parental supervision, both with the candy, but also parents dressing up in adult costumes to go with their children on the holiday. The most popular Halloween costume in 1974 was Richard Nixon. And that's not because kids were wearing that. Kids were wearing Planet of the Apes and things like that. That's adults that are going out with them. And that's a dramatic shift just in the holiday itself.
Yeah, and I wonder if it connects back to that thing that 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 we were talking about before, that there's this sort of fear during that time of things like stranger danger and this fear for children and this sort of loss of trust that's happening within communities during that time. And I wonder whether that kind of drove it into, Kelly's point about the sort of occult and religious part of it. It's interesting too to me that the religious opposition of Halloween really sort of like coincides with this time. The moral majorities rise and all of these other groups kind of melding in together.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, I think about the 1980s after this incident we're going to talk about tonight, like Johnny Gosh and the Missing Paper Boys, and I think the Stranger Danger really hit an all-time high in that era, like the early 80s, like way after the Pixie Stick Halloween murder. But yeah, I'm trying to think culturally, like true crime, what was happening in the 1970s with children and cases. I don't know.
Well, it's actually a decent question in terms of the coverage of what's going on in cases during that time. It could also be the sort of like the broader social things. The suburbs are being built out, transportation's easier. It's easier to become untethered and live. As we become more transient, it's easier to end up living beside people that you haven't grown up with forever. There's probably just like a lot more unknown going on, and then just also to that point, like Nixon, you have the Vietnam War that's been raging on. There's generally like a lot of fissures and lack of trust going on.
Well, and this is also the period of time when Rachel Carson is going to write this same year. She's going to write Silent Spring, which basically starts the environmental movement that we think of today. And Rachel Carson is going to argue in Silent Spring that for the first time in human history, kids that are kind of born are kind of constantly exposed to carcinogens in a way that like past generations weren't. And so I think if you think about this in the context of like that, in terms of what's happening politically with Vietnam, it just feels like there's a lot of threats that are being posed everywhere. There was a lot of discourses. Jason was speaking about the moral majority, about the kind of dangers of pornography and the kind of the R rating. The R rating kind of had developed about a decade before that. And so we get the first slasher films that are coming out with horror. And it feels like a lot of these things are kind of coalescing together where there aren't a lot of safe spaces. And so parents are becoming very actively involved in even things that were children's holidays because it's not obviously safe anymore. Even though, to Jason's point, nothing had actually happened. I mean, these researchers at Cal State, I think, did the study that Jason's describing where
Joel Best, I think.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So the rationale was basically that, okay, so if this story has been so widely circulated, it should be a big enough news event that we should be able to look at regional and national newspapers and find some coverage or proof of this recording. And they couldn't find it. And I think they looked from like 1958 to 1983. They couldn't find a single incident of stranger kind of danger specifically with this Halloween holiday.
And it's interesting, Kelly, you brought up what was going on with true crime during that time, but I wonder whether it's what was going on with crime during that time.
Okay.
Because the 1970s was the beginning of the big surge of urban crime that eventually led to the unbelievably high murder rates and crimes in the early 90s. Because prior to that, your crime per capita was a lot lower. And I wonder whether it was the surge of crime meeting the surge of media, right? A lot more TV, a lot more coverage of crime, a lot more it bleeds, it leads, where people had more fear of their neighbors.
Yeah, I think it started in the late 70s and like I said, hit that really high in the early 80s, like the first milk carton kid in the early 80s. Lots of random kidnappings that were high profile in the news happened in the 80s.
Satanic Panic too.
Yeah,
like
Satanic
every
Panic,
town
I
had
think
your
more like late 80s for that. Like yeah, a lot of stuff. Yeah.
All right, so y'all have all made some really good points, and I'm enjoying sitting back and listening to this. But can we go through the case? And for people that are not familiar with this, Brian, do you want to go through what actually happened that day or when this all started?
Sure. So I guess I'll try to keep this briefly, but on Halloween 1974, this guy, Ronald Clark O'Bryan, he was a 30-year-old optician from suburban Houston. And like many parents, he was taking his children out, supervising them trick or treating. His children were 8-year-old Timothy and a 5-year-old daughter named Elizabeth. And as they kind of departed that night, Ronald Clark O'Bryan was struggling with a lot of financial debt. His car had been repossessed recently. He had been forced to give up the home that he owned. And he had moved away from the neighborhood that their kids had spent most of their childhood in. And so the Halloween on 1974 was really a kind of reunion between Ronald Clark O'Bryan and his former neighbor, a guy named Jim Bates, and his children, Kimberly and Mark, who were ages 8 and 11. It was a rainy Halloween night. They were out. They were out trick or treating. His kids were wearing Planet of the Apes costumes, and so this is another big change that happened in Halloween. These like corporate big box costumes that we're kind of starting to get like in the 1960s. And
Let me interrupt you right
Yeah.
there because I've got a question about this. So he's on trying times. You know, it looks like he's having trouble making ends meet, but he feels pressured to buy his kids, you know, Planet of the Apes costumes. Is this really when kind of like the pressure to of the corporate Halloween, you know, how that's starting to take effect, where before you may have made a homemade costume and that
Sure.
was good enough, but now you've got to buy, you know, these, I don't want to name any names, but, you know, these big box stores that are selling movie quality costumes. Is that something that started in the 70s, or was that something that's kind of always been around?
I mean, it starts in the 1960s, but that like Planet of the Apes is like the first like Hollywood like licensed major movie. I think, to my knowledge, that was like that made its way into like major big box stores for Halloween. But yeah, I mean, certainly, I mean, in the turn of the century, kids would make their own homemade costumes. They look really creepy. If any listeners like go on Pinterest or on Google, do an image search, and those really grotesque like witches and goblins you'll see, they're made out of paper mache and just things that were old sheets and things like that. Kids weren't really dressing like that by the time we get to the 1970s, and so we have parents that are dressing up as like Richard Nixon as their kind of monster, and kids that are dressing up like, you know, costumes from Planet of the Apes, or
Skeletons.
that
Yeah.
girl was a popular one that year. Things like that.
All right. So they're going out trick or treating.
Mhm.
And do you want to go into kind of when this all starts?
Yeah, so the rain starts at some point during the night. The rain really starts picking up. It had been kind of drizzling, and his kids returned from a darkened house that they had knocked on, and they returned empty-handed. And they showed him, and he said, you know, he went away from the group and said, "Let me go try." And he walked up to the door, and then down the block from them. He said he would catch up with them. He caught up with them down the block and congratulated Jim Bates for having rich neighbors, and said, "Look what they're giving out," and had these giant pixie sticks. And he had 5 pixie sticks, I believe. And he gave 4 of the pixie sticks, both, you know, to his children and to Jim Bates' children. And then a 10-year-old girl named Whitney Parker came to the door right after they got back home, because they got these pixie sticks. The rainstorm picked up, so they retreated back to Jim Bates' house, their former neighbor. And around that time, a 10-year-old girl named Whitney Parker, who attended church with O'Bryan, came up to the door, and she pointed out that she recognized him, and he gave her the last pixie stick. And that's kind of where their night ended. So that was the 5th pixie stick, and they said their goodbyes. And according to O'Bryan, Timothy begged for his pixie stick before bedtime, and Elizabeth, his other daughter, said she did not want any. And so Timothy tried to eat the pixie stick at first, but he said it was like clumping in the straw, and he couldn't get it. He didn't really seem to notice or care that the pixie stick had been stapled together. And when the contents were too difficult for him to just kind of drink down himself, O'Bryan tried to rolled it with his hand and kind of got the contents to come out. And his son complained that it tasted really bitter. So he went and got him some Kool-Aid to help him wash it down. And then about 30 minutes later, he started convulsing and got very sick. And this is what kind of O'Bryan is going to tell the paramedics and the first ops on the scene. Yeah.
Died in his dad's arm, right? Gasping and convulsing.
He was convulsing, he was vomiting and gasping and went limp in his arms. Yeah.
Yeah. So I had heard maybe, I don't know if it's slightly different, but a little added detail to it, and I think this came from the daughter, Elizabeth. And it was that when they got home, their dad said to them that they could have one piece of candy. And she said she didn't want any candy. She was good. She'll have it tomorrow. And that he suggested the pixie sticks to both of them. Oh, wow. Which, thinking about what we find out is later, obviously, in the pixie sticks, this is a man who is clearly in a hurry.
Yeah.
And I always a couple things about this story, really sort of tell me something about the level of this guy's depravity. One, not only are you giving him to your own children, you're giving him to your best friend's children as a part of your little plot, their collateral damage. And a random girl from church also. And then you're suggesting it to your kids and one says no, right? You only got one shot at this. And, I don't want to give up the plot line of what's to come and why, but he really only had one shot at doing this. And he halved his payout in half there. He was that desperate. And it just says something about his desperation and his depravity.
With things like that too, that's not something that you just came up with on the spot.
No.
It was not you, got drunk and...
Well, it'd be really hard to get the life insurance policies that way.
Right.
Well, the life insurance policy 3 weeks prior, didn't he?
And called the life insurance company the morning of to figure out how.
I'm sure he was so heartbroken. That's why.
Yeah.
And the crazy part about this is that after his son dies, though, that we're just saying, when the ambulance is called and the police arrive, they want to know well, where were you at? Who were you with that night? And he tells them that he was with the Jim Bates and his family. And this is about 11 p.m. that night. So the police rush over to the Jim Bates house because they know maybe they have tainted candy as well. I mean, O'Bryan has volunteered this information to them. And the police bust into Jim Bates' house, and luckily none of the children had actually tried the candy. So then they find out about Whitney Parker, and they rush over to Whitney Parker's house, and they get to her about 2:00 in the morning. And she had wanted to eat her pixie stick when she got home, but her parents said, wait till morning and you can have the pixie stick then. And this was one of those occasions in which she actually listened, because when the police busted in her room at 2 a.m., she was holding the pixie stick in her hand and not eating it. And so she was okay.
So this is kind of goes back to what you were saying about the life lessons and, hey, listen to your parents and learn about waiting.
Yeah. Well, and also look at the practical implications of that are everyday life. You go grab from your grocery store a bottle of orange juice. You take the top off, what's underneath it, right? There's a tap, right? Those things come out of real things. Things like this, the Tylenol scare that happened in the early 80s, they really do have impact on the way that we think and our level of fear and our worry. And it weirdly does also protect us from things.
Can you imagine going and getting a bottle of orange juice that's just been duct taped shut and nowadays
because weren't the pixie sticks stapled shut? They had been opened and stapled shut.
They've been literally stapled shut. Yeah.
It just well, he knew what was in it.
I love the duct tape image.
That's a good image.
I can still remember as a kid going through my candy and like looking at the like Tootsie Roll Pops, and you know how they're not sealed, they're just like wrapped up.
Yeah.
And my parents were expecting us to like actually inspect the candy. I'm like, you know,
We would
it'd be
we would
nice if I
we
had
were
some examples of like what I'm supposed to be looking at, but you know, I'm like 8 years old and supposed to determine if this is poison or not.
but the stakes didn't feel exactly that high though. I don't know how you felt, but like I remember, yeah, we would have to spread out the candy on the floor and like
Yep.
do an
Yep.
inspection. But like, yeah, but now that you mentioned it, I'm not really sure what we were looking for because we weren't given any criteria, and it didn't really feel like
Razor
that
blades,
we
man.
were.
Razor
It
blades.
wasn't like the deer hunter. We weren't playing like roulette with like what piece of candy we picked up and scared. You know?
Looks good. Yeah.
Well, I remember too during our childhood, that's when the whole mall thing started,
Which
where
mall?
around in North Carolina, it was popular to like go to a mall to go trick or treating,
Oh
which
yeah,
just
we
ruined
had it
everything.
at police stations and
Yeah,
things like
Of
that.
like the
course, yeah.
fun of trick or
Community
treating was like
centers.
getting semi lost in the neighborhood.
I remember
On the candy.
churches that
Mhm.
had to do it, and even more. You could before in one town I lived in, you could go to the police station. You could do your trick or treating. You could also bring your candy into
Yeah.
the local hospital to have it X-rated.
Well,
That's just
yeah,
amazing.
they did
Expose
this
it
in
to
Atlanta.
radiation before you eat it. Yeah.
Hmm?
It's
Yeah,
crazy. They did this in Atlanta and Kansas and different places where after this case, this was one of those like effects. They would they would advertise on Halloween that you could bring your candy in and they would send it through an X-ray machine to ensure that there was no needles or razor blades in it. So
But like, and in this whole story, like you're telling, they rush over to the other kids' houses, and I know, later the police ask him to sort of identify the house, and he can identify almost every house except for the one where he got the
right.
pixie sticks, right? And he, eventually points out that one house, and I can't think of the guy's name, but there's a guy who, because he points out a house, they actually target the guy, arrest him at his workplace, which was the airport at the time. Luckily, he worked at the airport, so he had like 100 alibis. Tons of people had seen him. But as you go through this like whole plan, it just reminds me of like how stupid so many criminals are. Like if I were going to defraud anyone to murder someone, not that murdering is on my list, trying to tangle with an insurance company is about the last place you want to go because nobody has better investigators. I remember this from reporting. We would get like, an insurance company would like leak something to us because they couldn't get the U.S. attorney to look into it or whatever. Their investigative files were like better than the police ones that we FOIA'd. Like they are the last people you want to try and run a scam on.
True. But they haven't always been. This kind of harkens back to stories I've covered from like the 1800s and times like that where you could take an insurance policy off on a stranger or
Random people.
without an insurance policy on a stranger or literally anybody, and people would, and there were like some prolific serial killers who did that, female serial killers nonetheless, who would take out insurance policies on any random person who came their way and they would kill them. And it would take like 20 murders in before the insurance company back then would start looking into it. So it used to be an easy thing to do, not so much in these times, but yeah.
Yeah, but like, I mean, at least by then, we're talking like by the 1940s and
Yeah.
the 1950s and the 60s, we already had Johnny Dollar. Do you guys remember that? Yours truly, Johnny Dollar. You might be too old for that, but it's like the old radio drama about Johnny Dollar, who's the insurance investigator, one of the most popular radio ones, and he always got his man. He also had an action-packed expense account, but he always got his man. So, I just think that like, so many of these guys have these like grand plans that they don't really think through. It's so academic. Their plan is so, like, Brian, you get this. You were a police officer, so you guys go in to make
Cameron
an
is, yeah.
arrest.
Yeah.
Or I mean Cameron. Sorry, I'm mixing my Santanas. But Cameron, you were a police officer. You guys know. You go in to make an arrest. You got a plan. You got a backup plan. You got a backup plan for your backup plan. You got a plan if this happens, if that happens. I feel like so many of these criminals come in with like one plan, and they think their plan is just so brilliant, but they don't know how to adjust in the moment. And
You were actually talking about that on your last show. I was listening to you with
Julia,
yeah, excellent show, by the way.
Thank you.
With talking about Brian Koberger with Julia Cowie from
the console.
The Console. Yeah, great podcast, by the way.
Thank you.
Both of you. But yeah, and you're exactly right. Is like they think about that initial, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And here's like the first 3 steps. And it's like there's this assumption that everything's going to go right. And what you were talking about in your podcast, people should go listen to it. But that in military and police planning, like if we're going to go hit a house, we sit down and we go through multiple contingencies of everything we think is going to go wrong. And then when we do hit the house, if something does go wrong and we don't have a contingency, in Raleigh, you'll hear the guys yell, compromise, compromise, compromise. And that means the plan has gone to shit. And then training kicks in and you just do your thing and you flow off each other. But with, guys like this, it's like they think about the initial steps of, okay, I need money. I can get money from a life insurance policy if I kill my children. But they never think about, the police are going to get involved. Maybe the insurance company is going to look at this. What am I going to tell my neighbors? Those type of things. And what are people going to find out when they go to the house and figure out that guy didn't pass out pixie sticks?
Or like even just something as simple as like your kid just died from something, and like you're not showing a sign of guilt and remorse, right? Like if I accidentally got a pixie stick that led to my kid being poisoned, I would be totally guilty. I would be blaming myself, and I would do everything on earth to hunt down the person in the house. And those little things are like tells. But to the point you were making right before, it's experience, 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 right? That's how law enforcement agencies have figured out how to build in all these contingency plans, or the military. And there's no convention to learn to be a murderer, thank God. And there is not a lot of ways to get a lot of experience with it. And I really think it comes down to like, a lot of these people are so egotistical and so narcissistic.
Yeah, that's
think,
what I was going to say too.
Yeah, that they're just so brilliant. But I'm willing to bet at least some of the cops, like if they didn't see through him really early, they had big question marks in their heads.
I think they did see through him really early on in this case. The insurance people did, and the police officers did, and even during the funeral, he was like bumping into the casket and just completely oblivious to that. Oh, my dead child is in there. But what kind of people commit crimes like this? Narcissists. That's who does it. So that's not surprising that he would act that way.
But when you sing at the funeral, I think that's another mistake. Like if you murder your kid, you should probably be the gray man that is focused on looking like not saying a word and just trying to be somber and, tell people that you're too stressed to talk about anything, not take the stage, grab the mic and come up with, what was the song, Brian?
I had no idea he did this.
He sang a version.
Brian, why don't you fill everyone in about what happened at the funeral?
Okay, so to get to the mastermind point of this, though, it is important to note that the insurance policy is 2 policies for $20,000 apiece, and they had been executed 9 days before the murders. So this is not a very well thought out plan. And days before this, he just double checked again just to make sure the policy would pay out if something happened to them. So he's on police radar pretty quickly. But at the actual funeral, so he decides to do his own riff on the traditional hymn "Blessed Assurance," but he uses his son Timothy's name in the hymn as well. And to Kelly's point, yeah, he's like bumping into the casket. His neighbor Jim Bates, who was with him trick or treating, was like, "There's something not right with him because he's acting like he doesn't even notice his son's body is there in the casket. He was like running into it and just seemed oblivious and performative."
Yeah, an interesting thing jumping further in this little tale, but an interesting thing about him that goes to the broader point that we're talking about right now. Before he died, he made an apology, and he apologized to everyone that he hurt in his life, and he didn't mention his son.
Yeah.
He didn't mention his son. And even if you could still proclaim your absolute innocence and say, I am sorry that I did not check that piece of candy before giving it to my son, or that I could not have prevented his death, or pick what you want. You know, I think we're dealing with a person who I would take that apology and $2.50 and it wouldn't get you right on the New York subway. I mean, something else, but go on.
No, that's pretty much it. I mean, he's going to be. They kind of the insurance agent is really onto him just very early on, before the police even were, and they discovered he had purchased this cyanide, and his son had actually had enough cyanide to kill 4 adults, and so it was a pretty rapid death. But and so he's going to eventually be convicted and sentenced to death. But the process of executing him is going to take a long time. He has a lot of appeals. There's a lot of media coverage of his time on death row. He's able to he's making some early challenges to lethal injection. So in Texas, lethal injection was offered as a kind of humane alternative in the 1970s, but they started to notice that people dying of lethal injection during the procedure seemed to be experiencing pain, and it wasn't as quick a process as they initially imagined. And O'Brien is going to bring all of that up in appeals that are eventually go up to the Supreme Court, I believe. So
We should have given him a pixie stick full of cyanide.
Yeah,
you know, an interesting fact for this story, it would have been so poetic, like the artist in me would have loved this, but he was, at one point during his appeals, he was scheduled to be executed on October 31st, which would have been just so unbelievably
poetic justice right there.
It was postponed due to appeals, and I think, what was he executed eventually in 84 or something along those lines. But yeah, in one of the prior years, he was scheduled to be executed on Halloween.
So, question about that: if during executions on Halloween, do the guards dress up at all? Like, would you put on like a mask or
dress up like?
Are you asking what I would do personally, or what I would allow? Right. Yeah. I'm game for anything. I mean,
a Halloween execution.
For me, the person being executed can dress up for all I care.
That would be intense. Like, that would be really like extra morbid, just an extra dose of morbid. I think, but
something's fitting is around the time he's finally executed. I mean, this is around the time of the Atlanta child murders with Wayne Williams in Atlanta, and there's like all these different kinds of moments that seem to intersect with one another that don't independently have anything to do with one another, but seem to get collapsed together, I think, in the public's mind. So Ronald Clark O'Bryan is gone, but those traces of him are still around, to the point that, to this day, if you're asking people like ourselves who kind of grew up with that tradition, like, well, where did that come from? Most people can't tell you. I mean, I certainly didn't know this story. It was just kind of what you did and just assumed to be true. And I think a lot of these events that consistently reinforce that over time just had a way of kind of, propelling it forward to the point that's not even really about Ronald Clark O'Bryan anymore. It's just about kind of this general fear that's emerged from all these things together.
I can imagine that in 1984, at that time when he finally was executed, which actually, what was it, like 10 years, 11 years it took, something like that. But I can imagine at that time, with all of the craziness that was going on with all the child murders and everything in the news, the public was probably really cheering on that execution at that time once it finally came around. I mean, I bet they were like, you know how people cheer and they're very happy when someone
Yeah.
who
Especially in
killed a
Texas.
child is,
Yeah.
yeah, I bet I can imagine how that
Yeah, I
went
can only
down.
imagine the crowd outside
Right.
that execution.
And I've always thought, like, one of the interesting things about the way that this urban myth has evolved is that it was really designed to, if you think about it, designed, right, whether intentionally or not, designed to warn us about external threats. And that one of the real realities of life that the real story tells you is that the greatest threat to you is internal. It's the uncle, it's the cousin, it's your husband, it's your boyfriend. And it's so interesting to me that the urban legend is developed as this fear uh, uh, of strangers, when in reality, you should be worrying more about your mom or your dad putting some poison in your candy, to be honest, right? Or your husband. Definitely
Yeah.
worry about your husband. Don't take candy from your
It's
husband
always
or your
it's
boyfriend.
always
Always
the
the husband.
husband.
You know, I wanted to, for CrimeCon, get stickers, like stickers or pens that said, "Get a divorce." It's easier. It's so much easier.
Oh, so much easier.
Get a
Isn't
divorce.
that
Expensive
funny
though.
though? They always think, "Oh, I'm going to lose everything I worked so hard for. I'm just going to
You know
murder
what'll
them."
really do that for you? A murder conviction.
Yeah, because they will find out. So, I mean, with DNA and cameras and like, it's really hard to get away with
Right.
Or
a
just
murder
like,
anymore.
and the fact that you're the number one suspect. You're always the number one suspect.
Always.
Always. Always.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that people just have, for some reason, this hard time of getting over that. And you see that in this case. Like, okay, people are not going to ignore the fact that, you were the dad, you were the one that, was around this candy, and we're supposed to, I guess, ignore that and ignore the fact that you were the only person that, went to this strange door. And I feel like that a lot of when we look at other murders, it's like the same logic of, if you look at statistically, it's someone that you're in a dating relationship with, or someone that you've got some type of, it's not stranger murder, or, just like stranger rapes are rare too.
Right.
So it's like you're saying, normally it's a person that,
Yeah. If it's a personal cause, if it's that
But
they're not.
we just as people, we just love a mystery and we love horror and we love all that stuff. So we want to believe that the people closest to us would never do something like that. And I guess it just makes for like more of a mystery when we think it's like, because movies, it's always a stranger or whatever, but
Yeah, because I think
it's
it's
not
like
usually like that.
we fear the things that are outside of the tribe and we feel
Hmm.
safe with the things that are inside. So it's always the monster in the woods or the shadow in the alley. And, strangers for us, I think, really represent the unknown and the scary, but they're not necessarily the only risk, because I think there's this core myth that we have, and I think families are super important, tribes and clans and all these things. But I think there's a core myth of family protection, and I think one of the impacts for me of realizing that this idea of family protection is a myth, that I feel even more blessed to have my brother and blessed to have my mother and blessed to have my father, because they made a choice to be good people. Because not everyone is like that, but I think that's a core myth that we carry, that it's really hard to get past. But when you do get past it, man, and you do have a family member that's good to you, and you recognize that that family member is making a choice to be good to you, it's not just this inherent, innate thing. Purely, it makes it all that more powerful. And I hate to kick the media as a former or current member of it. It's really hard for me to tell sometimes, but we like really empathize, or we really amplify things that are really exotic, right? Like the old line is, the story is not dog bites man, it's man bites dog. So that's what we write about. We write about these freaky, wild scenarios. We write about the stranger abduction because it's rare. But because we write about it, everybody thinks it's really common. And no, actually, the person more likely to adopt you or abduct you is your, parent who's estranged from the other parent. Like that's the most common.
Right.
Yeah.
Very interesting thoughts. So Brian, you said that he was eventually executed. The kids are dead. Did you bring up the fact of what happened? Nothing happened to the other kids that had the pixie sticks, correct?
Right, that's correct. Yeah, no, I was actually something I actually don't know, and I probably should know this, but I don't know what the rest of their lives turned out to be. Like, I think that's such an interesting kind of like where you're at the heart of this story that becomes this kind of big case. Like, I wonder what the Bates kids in particular, or this Whitney, what the rest of their Whitney Parker, what the rest of their lives were kind of like after that, but yeah, there was just one death from this entire thing that spiraled out into this really big impact.
All right. And before we close up, Kelli, I know that I told you that I would bring this up. Do you want to fill us in on a case that you've been following for a while about a real monster?
Yeah. Speaking of children, tragic stories about children. In 2015, you may have heard this in the news. 6-year-old Logan Tipton was brutally stabbed to death in his sleep in his home with his family while they slept in the middle of the night. And it wasn't a family member, it actually was a stranger, one of those crazy stranger cases. Ronald Exantis was the murderer's name. He drove from another state in the middle of the night, no connection whatsoever, but he was having kind of a psychotic break at the time. He thought he was in an episode of Grey's Anatomy. And he was kind of just like looking for signs of where to turn, where to go. He saw the Christmas lights on the porch of their home and a street sign that was like Gray Street or something like that. So he turned, he went into their home. It was the kind of community, Versailles, Kentucky, where you don't lock your doors at night, and they didn't. And he walked right in. He walked into their kitchen. He found a knife. He walked upstairs. He went into the children's room, and he just went berserk. Basically, he stabbed Logan. He tried to stab the other children who shared a room with Logan, and his dad, Logan's dad, Dean, heard the commotion, came in the room, tried to jump on him and subdue him and get him to stop, and everybody was injured in this, and they called 911 and all of that. But Logan died in his dad's arms. There was not a ton of coverage when this happened in 2015, and I heard about it. I followed the case, and in 2021 I did an episode about it on my first podcast. I had not been podcasting very long, but it's a case that's always stuck with me. I wrote about it in my friend Lauren Sample's book, Through the Shadows. It just has always broken my heart because anything with kids, and this was just a crazy stranger on stranger violence. But what's really upsetting is this week, or last week, I think now. But he was sentenced. He was found not guilty of murder by reason of insanity.
Reason of insanity.
Yeah. Yes, reason of insanity. And he was found guilty though of I think it was, I'm not sure, but it was like a very like lesser charge, and he got 20 years for it. I think it was assault, something like that. 20 years for that, but he served 10, and he's out now. So he's out. He's out. So he's going to be able to have like a normal life, and it's just really upsetting last week that happened. So that's been on my mind a lot lately. Have you guys seen that case in the news and his release? What do you think about that?
Well, one, it proves the opposite side of the point I was making earlier, which is we should be concerned about strangers, right? Reminds me of like the Vampire of Sacramento guy. Do you guys
Yes,
know
but
that
that's the
story?
kind of thing you can't prepare for that. That is
Yeah.
so crazy and
Richard,
random.
do you guys know that one? Richard Trenton Chase. This was like
I remember
he
hearing about it, but
yeah, so
you have to refresh my memory.
he basically picked, so he had several victims, and I will not go into the details of his many different things he did, because they're like some things that there's actual value in knowing, and some things that like you just probably don't want to know. But one of his attacks was a home invasion where he killed an entire family. And the way he selected them, it was so interesting. The way he selected them is he had this sort of like vampire thing where he wanted to drink blood and eat
Yeah.
brain matter and all
Right.
sorts of other stuff like this. And the way he selected them was he would walk up to their door, and I personally think this was all sexually motivated, because home invasion, burglary, all those things go with it. But he would walk up to their door, try to turn their doorknob, and if the door didn't open, that meant him as a vampire was not being welcomed in. And if the door did open, it meant the people wanted him there. And so, yeah, random things do happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
No.
Yep. With mental illness, I think, as a big part of that.
Component. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
But he was never actually, was he actually put in like a general population in prison, or was he in a mental institution?
That's a good question. I'm not actually sure what the answer to that is. I want to say it was a mental facility of some sort,
Yeah.
but I don't think it was like general population. I think something would have happened to him if he was in like the general population after doing what he did, but I think it
Yeah.
was like a mental facility.
I mean, it does not surprise me. One of the cases that we talk about in A Murder on Campus, shameless plug, is that a guy named Jeremy Beanie, who got out of Holly Hill, and he stabbed his
And
girlfriend.
Holly Hill was a psychiatric
Yes, yeah.
facility.
Okay.
It's a psychiatric hospital in Raleigh. He gets out, gets in an argument with his girlfriend, stabs her like 30 something times is when they stop counting, to the point of he took a break during the stabbing, and then like decides to take a shower, tries to kill himself in the shower, and calls 911 after he unsuccessfully kills himself. And he ate a bowl of cereal, I know, before he called 911. But anyway, so we get there for a 911 hang up, and craziest shit I've ever seen, where middle of the daytime, we're about to get off work, and we go to the door, and he opens up the door like a few inches and sticks his face in, and he goes, "Are you the police?" And we're wearing like Raleigh police uniforms. Luckily, it's me and my friend Kyle. And I'm like, "Yeah." And he closes it and opens it up. And he's this tall black guy with a big afro and glasses. And he goes, "Yeah, I called the police because," and I look at his neck, and it looks like there is a pie removed from his neck. Like you can see all the insides. There's no blood on him, but it's gray. And he's like a medium complexion black male, but it's gray around his neck. And he goes, "Yeah, I killed my girlfriend last night, and then I tried to kill myself."
Just calm like that. Just
Yeah. And so I grabbed his wrist and I flipped it around, and it looked like there was a orange wedge missing from his wrist. Like to the point you could see down to the bone. There's no blood on him. And like my brain is still trying to compute of like what's going on here. So I can't put a handcuff on him. So I just like grabbed him by the shoulder and plopped him on the ground, and gave him a quick pat down, tell him to, give him some commands. And I look at him and I go, "Are you sure she's dead?" And just matter of fact, he looks at me and goes, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure." And I said, "Well, where is she right now?" He goes, "In the back bedroom." And so I told Kyle, I said, "Hey, are you good with him?" He's like, "Yeah." So lights are out. It turns into a horror movie at that point. I've got a tack light in one hand, my pistol in the other, and as soon as I step in, I can see blood. And I start like quickly clearing the apartment. I get to the back bedroom and I can see an object that is covered by a blue blanket. You can tell there's like blood soaked through. And I go to pull off the blanket and it's his girlfriend and her head is barely hanging on.
Mhm.
Well, that guy's getting out next year in 2026.
Why?
That would be my question. Like, I just don't think that some people like that
And
are
was
fit for
he
society.
was he not guilty by reason of insanity?
They gave him a plea deal.
Yeah. So this is an interesting thing, and it varies from state to state. But North Carolina actually has one of the toughest laws. If you are convicted, if I get convicted of assault, and let's say I go away for 2 years, I would normally go away for 2 years for it. I'm making this up, right? Because I'm not a lawyer. But if I get not guilty by reason of insanity, it doesn't matter whether my sentence would have been 40 years or it would have been 2 years. I don't get out until the psychiatrists at the state hospital approve it. And I think in the Kentucky case, the Logan Tipton, they want a law that's similar to that. So, like legally, there's always this gamble in North Carolina whether you should ever say that you are insane because you might like end up in prison for the rest of your life on a traffic ticket.
Yeah.
So maybe it's a little extreme on the other side. But so like those are the difficult things that you have to navigate. You come to a place like Virginia, you're going to have a relatively fixed term along with the possibility of being able to get out if the psychiatrists say you're rehabilitated, but there's going to be a max that you're potentially going to do. So I think, taking your example, Cameron, it may be very well that they would have been better off if he had said not guilty by reason of insanity, if that's the way he had been convicted.
Yeah, and
Why?
it just
I'm sorry, go
amazes me that they even work with people like that. Like,
Yeah,
why
I was
don't
going to
you
say,
take
why would they offer someone like that a plea? He obviously murdered her. There's no like gray area there. Like he did it. Why would they offer him a plea on that? I don't understand. That's the part that I don't understand.
Judicial economy,
Right,
right?
exactly.
You have limited resources for prosecutors. You have limited resources for all other things. Why
Like a
take a guy
slam dunk of a case.
Yeah, but like, why take a slam dunk of a case to trial because you're expending all these resources and
Okay.
efforts, and it would be no big deal if you had an unlimited number of cops and prosecutors. But the truth is, every case you take to trial means a case you're going to decline to prosecute on something else.
Okay.
So that's why they do things like that. But it creates these very weird situations in these spaces where we don't know how to handle them. And I also think that's part of the reason why, for better or worse, a lot of juries, in cases where people are clearly insane, will not return a not guilty by reason of insanity verdict and will return a guilty one because they're afraid that the person's going to get out.
Okay.
So,
Let's like kind of compare this to, since it's Halloween, horror movies. Michael Myers was insane. He killed people.
Yeah.
The whole premise of the movie is that he killed all these people. He was put in a maximum security mental health facility and he just kept getting out and he would do, but like I feel like someone who does something like what these men did is so heinous. They should be locked up like Michael Myers for eternity in a mental health facility. That's what I think.
Well, and it's so predictable.
Yeah.
Just like in Michael Myers, where he's going to break out and he's going to start murdering people again.
Yes.
There's no way that you do something that heinous and then never do it again.
They're the
but
most
did you
dangerous.
guys remember what Dr. Loomis says in the first adaptation of the the Michael Myers, the films, he says that he's purely and simply evil. It's not until the later versions do you get the whole antisocial personality disorder, mental illness thing. And I think that's also part of the problem. Like in looking at the case that you're describing, Kelly, and thinking about like the vampire of Sacramento guy, Richard Chase, like it is possible to both be insane and evil at the same time. Like in Chase's case, the first thing he killed was a cat, and he was clearly insane, no question. He was
Did
insane.
he also start fires and wet the bed?
But
Part of the McDonald triad. Did he do that too?
that stuff
We
is
don't know.
that hokey science, not pseudoscience.
Yeah.
But he had a reason for killing the cat, right? And his reason for killing the cat was he watched a TV show, and a cat on the TV show, the whole shtick for it was that the cat was getting this high class medical treatment, and he felt like he should be getting that medical treatment, so he killed his cat. So you can be insane and also have a reason. His reason to kill that whole family was to, drink their blood. You may both be insane and totally responsible, and or at least what I would call insane, seriously mentally ill, not necessarily legally insane, but totally also either be evil or have a reason where you should be put away for a long time.
Yeah. What's scary about Ronald Exantis to me was he was a registered nurse. He had a normal life. He had a girlfriend. He had no prior history of violence or mental health issues. Later, people kind of talked about he was like a football player. He was athletic. Maybe he had some brain trauma that didn't surface until later. But other than that, there was just nothing. For a few weeks, he was crying a lot. He was acting weird. He was saying weird things. There was some sort of thing going on, but nobody ever expected him to do something like this. He had never done anything like that before. It was just kind of out of the blue. So that makes it very
And I think
baffling.
bringing it to those like Halloween films that both of y'all are referencing earlier, I mean, those films do come out during this era with Ronald Clark O'Bryan as well. I mean, we have the Halloween, and that's like this kind of, Michael Myers is the name, but it's essentially a kind of faceless, irrational terror that doesn't speak, and is this really interesting kind of embodiment of fears. And it's fascinating too to think that like this, in terms of this danger towards children, my personal favorite of the Halloween franchise, Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, is really about this like, this like Irish like business owner who's devised this insane plot to murder all the children of the world on Halloween. And he's doing so by giving them the infamous silver shamrock corporate produce mask. And so interesting kind of like stuff that's like kind of going on where even if this is pop culture we're talking about, but whether it's the movies you're going to scare yourself, or it's the stuff that's happening on the nightly news with the Tylenol murders, in 82, and the stuff with the Atlanta child murders. And
but think about, to Kelly's point, why that stuff scares us is because it lays bare, I think, the reality of violence, that you can't actually protect yourself from it. It is actually quite random. Assuming it's not for a personal cause, right? Like, it doesn't involve drugs, money, a relationship with somebody Most of the other murders that occur, you can't really protect yourselves from them. And I think something about the randomness, like I'm the kid who takes the shamrock mask versus I'm not the kid who takes it, or I'm the one who crosses Michael Myers' path, or I happen to pick up the Pixie Stick versus I don't. I think there's something very frightening about the randomness of reality of violence, that it's like Gwyneth Paltrow in that movie. It's a sliding glass door moment. You just happen to walk through the sliding glass door 1 second too late or 1 second too early.
And it comes into, it brings in themes like destiny, fate, almost a magical kind of feeling, like, well, I guess I was destined to take the mask and die, and they weren't. It's like
loss of control.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, and if Halloween has any socializing function still in 2025, that's an interesting way to think about it too. That what the holiday is socializing kids into is this idea that this like loss of control that they actually have in the world, that lots of dangers that present themselves, and there are these efforts to like assert different kinds of authority that offer different kinds of protections. The trunk or treat, the kind of trick or treating at the police station of all places, which is the oddest one I think of all, and or like or certainly just at a minimum trick or treating with your parents. It seems like it's socializing that this is kind of, I mean, because the original holiday and dressing up like goblins and things, in some ways this was about kind of like confronting kind of death as a child, kind of
Uh-huh.
looking in the face and going out by yourself into the night, a place that's scary for children, and kind of confronting those fears and kind of coming to some coping mechanism of how you kind of navigate that, the adult world that is out there and these other things that are out there beyond you. And now it seems like no matter what you're armed with around you, it's still a very like kind of threatening thing.
And
That's
it's,
part of the fun of it, the danger for
Yeah.
kids. Like, I
yeah.
don't know these people. I don't know this house. Could be candy, could be poison. Not to make light of it or anything like
Yeah,
that, but that's like this big house as a small child. You're just walking up
yeah.
and it's in the dark and everyone's wearing a mask. That's part of the fun of it, I think.
Yeah, and I think we can't. I think there's something lost though when we don't have some element of that because we can't protect ourselves from everything. And at some point we have to look at the odds or you're going to spend your life trying to protect yourself from the most random things and then a brick's going to fall off the side of the building and kill you or whatever it is.
Exactly. Or
Like
a car accident or,
yeah, and
you
you will
know,
have
yeah.
lived your whole life trying to protect yourself from and
Yeah.
and I think it's when the odds are low and it's costing you a lot to protect yourself from it. And I mean, I'm not saying that this is, but I was thinking about this after the Minnesota church shooting. I had a friend of mine where the families at her church started hiring security guards for the kids who were going to school. And I was thinking to myself about how it reminded me after 9/11. Everybody was like, we're taking all these steps and TSA and people are putting these, roadway jersey walls in front of buildings. And at the end of the day, if somebody wants to terrorize you or wants to hurt you, whatever barriers you put up, they're just going to one up them. So
Right.
at what point do you say to yourself, you know what, I'm going to go out and live this fragile, precious miracle of a life and take calculated risks so I can really live. And, I will be a billionaire when I figure out where to draw that line. But,
Have you
um,
noticed in pop culture, TV, movies, things like that, there's this resurgence of themes that are like back in the 80s, back when things were innocent, like Stranger Things, you know, movies and TV shows and series like that where it was a more innocent time and kids would go leave their house and ride their bike in the morning and not come back until it was dark. That's kind of like a really popular thing happening now. I think people long for that
mhm.
You know what's
time.
really funny about that, and just to piggyback on that, those things that we look back at our childhoods and we just thought were normal, like building forts and, making up games. My mother's actually in or used to be in the educational world. And I remember telling me how they have trainings for teachers, how to teach kids like how to build a fort out of sticks and like how to make up a pretend game. And I think that those are, when we were kids and we're making these things and like making up these games, we weren't worried about the consequences of it and like the structure of everything. And I feel like that's everything just got so structured, and the helicopter parent came over that now
Also,
hopefully we're going to
social
see some.
media, right? Like social media,
Right.
constant input, constant output, constant input. There's, because you're talking about like kids making up games for themselves or building a fort in the woods. And there's this moment where, so I'm like the tail end. I'm like at the last gate of Gen X. So, and you know, let's see, would she be my ex-sister-in-law, sort of? Yeah. So her kids, and I remember us sitting out on this beach in Acadia National Park, and all the kids are like playing and talking, and one of the kids is out sitting on his own making a sandcastle. And I remember one of the adults making a comment about that kid, who I hope is not listening, and saying that kid is going to be trouble because he's antisocial. And I was like, that kid has an imagination. He is going to have skills that other people don't have. Like, you're missing this piece. But I do think some of that comes from fear, like fear of the unknown, what my kids are doing, fear of the kid who's not talking when he could be just making up things in his head. And to your point about like the helicopter parent piece of it, we've got into a space that is really, really, really anxious and constantly has inputs and outputs. And there should be spaces for kids to go roam on their own, right?
Yeah.
Calculated, but roam on their own.
And I think that's what I always loved about Halloween is the freedom to dress up, use your imagination, go out with your friends and like tackle the night, together and go get candy. And I just feel like that's kind of been forgotten and lost, and hopefully we come back to that.
Like a classic 80s movie.
Yeah.
Yes. Without Freddy Krueger at the end.
Exactly. A good wholesome one. Where everyone lives.
Hallmark
E.T.
movie.
or something
Hallmark.
like
E.T.
that.
There we
Yeah.
go. E.T.
Well, it is interesting, this idea with all these like 80s films, though, like the resurgence that Kelly was mentioning, because like nostalgically looking back to the 80s as a time of freedom. But like we've been describing, I mean, like growing up in the 1980s, like, like we did, that it didn't, well, I mean, it didn't necessarily feel that way at the time, but also it seemed like looking back on it, a lot of the actual popular culture, because I mean, like Nightmare on Elm Street, is a lot of it is about these like spaces that parents can't protect you in, that are like, they're like, so on one hand, there's like all this parental authority is asserting itself and all these institutions that are exerting themselves more. But we're also constantly being reminded, to like Jayson's point, that it doesn't really matter, because whether it's the dream space that Freddy Krueger penetrates or whether it's the complete irrationality of Michael Myers, like none of these things ultimately matter and do anything. And that's a weird thing to be nostalgic about, because I don't really know kind of what that kind of void is that's fulfilling. Like what is that void that's tapping into? That nostalgia for this thing it's like a very superficial idea of this kind of world that didn't exist in that kind of way. Does that make sense?
No, and I remember my parents bemoaning during the 80s how my brother and I didn't have as much freedom as they did. And in retrospect, we had so much freedom. We could leave the house, go wherever we want, like generally stay within a certain area. Like, they knew our bike, we were on our bikes because they looked in the garage and the bikes were gone, right? So there was really a lot of freedom for us in retrospect. But I remember my parents even talking about that piece. But I do think a lot of the stranger stuff, not to get too philosophical with you guys, but you kind of know my gist already. But I think a lot of it has to do with I think people have a deep need as humans and a deep desire for belonging. And I think because people feel untethered and unconnected, their fear rises. I was thinking about this last week. I got sick. Over the years, I have a neighbor that, I've become really close friends with him and his wife. And what a comfort it was, even though I didn't call them, just to know I could call my neighbor who I trusted, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that sense of community and belonging, in the sense that there's an absence of it, and I do think things like social media, mass media, all sorts of other things play, divisive politics, all play a role in this sense of disconnection. And I think our fears heighten because, and I don't necessarily mean a geographic community, but so many people feel like they don't have a community. They don't have somebody to turn to. They're worried about their job, their mortgage, their blah, blah, blah. Well, if you were in a world where you did have a sense of community and belonging, you might be worried about your job and mortgage, but we're going to catch you, right?
Mhm.
And you can worry a little less. And in that world, for people like my parents, maybe it wasn't just that they were more open, but they also knew that, five of our neighbors, if they saw something, they would call,
Mhm.
or if they had
Yeah.
noticed something. And I think that loss of that sense of community heightens fear and drives some of this stuff. And that there's this constant push pull, right? If Freddy Krueger is about kids running around doing stuff they shouldn't be and look out for, the Nightmare on Elm Street, I do think there's just this constant push and pull between that idea of more freedom and less freedom. And I think a lot of it has to do with like not having a sense of belonging.
Yeah. Back in those days, people still played cards together on Friday night and had block parties and
No.
had landlines and
Yep.
had all their neighbors' phone numbers written down. I've lived in this house a long time. I don't know my next door neighbors' first names, to be
Right.
honest. I
Right.
don't. That's
Right.
pretty disconnected. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And and I think, I mean, are we better or are we worse? It's really hard to tell because it depends on what piece of it you're talking about. But I think, all of us probably have a need for belonging and maybe a responsibility for belonging. So you know what I'm going to do? I am going to go meet my new next door neighbor that I have not introduced myself to. And I'm going to go introduce myself to her. So that'll be my little part of drinking my own medicine for
That's
today.
awesome.
That is awesome.
Something good is coming out of this episode.
Right. Other than a good story and lots
Yeah.
of yapping.
And you can tell us how it goes on episode 2,
So
because
I will let you know.
you both are on, or all three of you are on the hook. Brian, you never have a choice. But Jayson and Kelli, hopefully you'll join us for the other episodes.
Absolutely. This was fun. I like how the conversation just spun into different things, lots of rabbit holes.
I'm glad we were able to actually fit a true crime story in the middle of that conversation.
Yeah.
I was kind of wondering how this was going to go. I was looking at all the dynamics, and I'm like, this could go really well or it could go awful. I think it'll go well, though.
How could you think it would go awful? Come on.
Who's to say if I'm involved?
I had to tell my brother, I was like, look, Brian, you've got to keep this short because,
I really-
He kept
told
it
me he had
very
36
short.
pages of notes.
I really tried. I was like, I'm not going to have like notes in front of me right now, so it's just kind of what habit.
But I was impressed by your command of facts, right? You prepare, so you can answer the question in the moment.
All right. Well, let's save something for the next episode. Before we go, Kelli, what would you like to plug?
Well, if you liked my voice, I can put you to sleep with my podcast, which is True Crime Sleep Stories. I tell terrifying tales, but in a non-startling way, several times a week. So you can find me at True Crime Sleep Stories.
Great. And also, I've got to recommend your YouTube shorts. They're absolutely hilarious.
Oh,
especially
thank
your
you.
ones about being an author.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, if you're having a bad day, go watch those. I promise you'll laugh.
Yes, I have some books too based on the podcast. So I have 3 books out, True Crime Sleep Stories, also volumes 1 through 3. I try to not take myself too seriously, so I like to be funny if I try anyway.
Yeah, no, you do a great job with it all. Jayson, where can we find you and how can we support you?
Who cares about me? But it is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. But here's what I would suggest. If you want to do something for me, donate to Private Investigations for the Missing, which is Bruce Maitland, Brianna Maitland's dad's charity that provides highly qualified private investigators to families of people who have someone who are missing. It's hard to find good investigators. A lot of the people out there who are saying they're PIs are really scammers. Today is Brianna's birthday. So we're recording on that. She's been gone more years than she was here. And I think that is an awesome cause. And if you want to do something for yourself to make yourself feel good, go find a GoFundMe somewhere and give $2, $3, $5 to somebody who's struggling with health issues, because there are a lot of people who are struggling with that, and it's going to get tougher in the next year. So if you want to do anything, you can look up my podcast, but make that like your tertiary goal. Go find somebody to do something nice for and check out Private Investigations.
What a good message. That's great.
Jayson is, that's what I like about having him on the show, is he's always doing good for others. We did a story together on Ashley luring heavy runner that does not get the attention that it deserves. And that is something that he continues to do. And yeah, so much respect to you.
Thanks.
Brian, how can we support you besides buying A Murder on Campus, The Professor, the Cop, and North Carolina's Most Notorious Cold Case? That's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Audible, and Kindle.
What is this Murder on Campus thing you guys keep talking about?
Yeah. I mean, that thing? Yeah. Here it's a good page turner.
I heard there was a really good episode on my podcast about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
Go
still
check
get
out that.
compliments about it.
So yeah, so that book is out there, and if you have already bought that book, which I hope many of you have, or if you are looking for other things, I'll just defer to our other guests about things that they were mentioning to kind of donate to. So there's lots of good options here.
Cool.
All right. Well, if you want to support me, you can like and follow and subscribe to Santana True Crime, and we've already given the plug for the book. So Jayson, Kelli, Brian, I can't thank you enough for doing this. It was a blast. I'm looking forward to episode 2. For those that are still with us, we're planning on doing 4 of these all the way up till Halloween. I'm really hoping I can get Jayson and Kelli in all of them, but you'll have to wait and see. Take care and good night.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.